Welcome, data center friends from all over the planet, to this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and I'm thrilled to have you joining us for this week's live Q&A show, where we address some of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem, from data center operators like colocation, hyperscale, edge, modular, wholesale data center providers, as well as the dozens of different kinds of data center technology companies and data center facilities related companies, data center construction, real estate and investment kinds of companies, as well as the vibrant outsourced sales and marketing ecosystem in and around data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. And this show is for you regardless of where you sit on the go-to-market on the GTM team. Perhaps you work as an account executive or a sales development or business development rep, an SDR or a BDR on the sales team, or maybe you work in some kind of marketing capacity, either as a one-person marketing team or specializing in digital, events, social, field marketing, demand generation, some other facet of marketing for your business. Or perhaps you work in the post-sales capacity, either in account management or client success, AM or CS, depending on how you call it within your company. Or perhaps you're in some kind of product-related role as a product manager, a product marketer, or in innovation. It's first cousin of product management. Or perhaps your company has an indirect sales model as well, and you work in some kind of channel partnership, channel account management, channel consulting type of role. Or perhaps you are the executive sponsor, the leader, the one whose job it is to go out and recruit the best and the brightest from the industry to join your team and have amazing onboarding, integration, collaboration, alignment, so that everyone is sitting in the right place on the bus, rowing their oars at the right speed, playing their musical instrument at the right time, at the right tempo, with the right sheet music right in front of them, whatever analogy you prefer. So you, your team, your company can tap into this period of amazing growth in the global data center ecosystem. If this is the first time you're joining us, welcome. We're thrilled to have you with us for the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've been with us before, we're thrilled to have you back as a frequent flyer. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, be sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing email newsletter that comes each week to your email inbox on Sundays. You can sign up, you can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. Now, we're super curious, what do you do in the data center ecosystem? Please drop a comment on whatever platform you're watching on and let us know. So what is on the agenda for this week's show? We're going to first look at how a data center integrator can create visibility and opportunity for third-party service providers. Next, we'll turn our attention to how to market and sell co-location and managed services in data center facilities. After that, we'll look at how a data center operations optimization consultancy can bridge the knowledge gap between industries. After that third question, we'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll tackle how a co-location backup solutions and data security provider can get SMB, small and medium-sized business clients, how a data center design, construction, and management firm markets and sells data center solutions. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's show, we'll talk about how to establish wholesale data center brand recognition in the marketplace. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you are facing, or your team is facing, your company is facing, that you think would be a great topic to discuss in an upcoming episode of Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, please be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform you're watching on, and we will add that to the consideration queue of potential topics to address in upcoming shows. So without any further delay, let's jump right into this week's first question. What do we got? So, first question is, how does a data center integrator create visibility and opportunity for third party service providers? That is a fantastic question. And most of the time, before I dive into these questions, I usually like to set the context of where this particular company lives within the data center ecosystem, as well as who their ideal clients, who their primary and secondary buyer personas are likely to be. So, data center integrators can be specialized in the data center facilities part of the ecosystem, like specializing in power, cooling, physical security, commissioning, decommissioning, something along those lines. But most of the time, the companies that consider their business model as a data center integrator are a little more closely aligned with the technology side of the data center ecosystem. And then, of course, there's some, I don't even want to say unicorns, but a little more versatile kinds of professional services firms that are able to span both the technology and the facilities side, either with different teams, different kinds of personnel, different kinds of talents. So for a data center integrator, this is typically a company that's specializing in one or more of the 22 different kinds of data center technologies that we track over at DCSMI. So things like storage, hardware, cabling, connectivity, automation, cybersecurity. So typically expertise that's spanning one or more of those areas, and you're looking to create visibility and opportunity for third-party service providers. So usually data center integrators, it's relatively unusual for data center integrators to have a menu of products and services that's entirely proprietary, that they've built that are their own. Sometimes they have a few products and services, especially services that are unique to what they do. But most of the time, data center integrators are a type of channel partner for data center technology companies, or in the case of facilities focused integrators, for data center facilities related companies. So you might be an integrator that works, for example, with Dell hardware or Cisco hardware or Vertiv products or Eaton products or something like that on the facility side. So there's a couple of different ways to go with creating visibility and opportunity for third-party service providers. What this usually strongly implies is you're a channel partner, and in addition to your full-time equivalent, your salaried employees, you're typically carrying relationships with a number of third-party subcontractors to supplement your team. And this is a big deal because it's a key part of you being able to deliver a true complete solution. And this whole idea of single point of contact, complete solution, this has literally been around for decades. I remember when I wrote first book for Microsoft in the late 1990s, a single point of contact, anything and everything having to do about IT for a particular client, or in this particular case, for a kind of data center operator or a enterprise that has its own data centers. They're hiring your firm, they're hiring an integrator to solve a specific kind of problem, to provide a specific kind of solution from a single party, as opposed to potentially hiring 5 or 10 different companies that do small pieces of it. No, they recognize that a huge part of accountability, a huge part of total cost of ownership, a huge part of supply chain optimization, a huge part of just efficiency comes down to a single company like an integrator actually integrating all of the specific pieces of the puzzle to make this happen together. So creating visibility and opportunity for third-party service providers, usually in the case of a data center integrator as a channel partner, you're taking the lead of building your brand in the marketplace, generating and nurturing leads in the marketplace, converting some of those leads into sales opportunities, taking some of those sales opportunities across the finish line to new clients and potentially repeat clients and upsells and cross sells and retention and account expansion, all that great stuff. And usually in that context, the integrator usually does not want to create visibility and opportunity for what they might call their white labeled third-party service providers. In other words, their third-party service providers are kind of invisible behind the scenes, and they're working as an extension of the integrator, even though the people that work for that third-party service provider may be getting their paychecks, may be getting paid from a different company, either corporate to corp, as opposed to W-2 in the US or similar kinds of direct full-time employee payroll arrangements from the integrators. So in the case of creating visibility and opportunity, what this usually means is instead of promoting the service provider company, they're more broadly promoting the service provider's category of solution. So let's say, for example, that historically your company hasn't done well with environmental monitoring, or hasn't done especially well with DCIM, with DCIM kind of software, or maybe you haven't done a lot with power management. And all of a sudden you sign a couple of agreements with third-party service providers, with subcontractors to your integrator firms that have unique expertise in this area. What this means is, going forward, as you're trying to figure out your go-to-market playbook, as you're trying to back into what your ideal client profile looks like and trying to figure out your prioritized buyer personas, you all of a sudden have a new set of skills on your bench and your tool belt that you can bring to the table. And with that in mind, all of a sudden now the kinds of topics that you might talk about in your educational resources, at your educational events, will by definition be potentially more expansive. Will this change your ideal client profile? Will this change your choice of buyer personas? That depends. It really depends on how strategic these additional third-party capabilities are to what you're trying to do as a company. Is it possible that because you sign on 2 or 3 really interesting subcontractors that this changes the entire strategic directory of your firm? It can. It usually doesn't. Usually the reason that you're hiring third-party talent is because you're supplementing skill sets either that you don't have that are urgently needed, or that just are seen to be not as core to your mission. Usually services that are a lot more core to what you do, you're typically going all in full-time with multiple full-time hires, multiple full-time teams, and you want access to that talent 48, 50, 52 weeks of the year, 724, 365, as opposed to just bringing it in as needed. So can it cause you to want to tweak your go-to-market playbook and your ideal client profile and your buyer personas? It can, but these are strategic roadmap kinds of issues that more than likely your C-level, your CEO, your head of product, your CTO, in the case of an integrator professional services firm, would make these kinds of decisions. So for creating more visibility and opportunity, a lot of times it's not necessarily that you're going to tweak the geographic part of your ideal client profile, because in the case of integrators, it's usually still, there's definitely some things that you can do remotely, but there's also a lot that requires initial site surveys, initial installations, from time to time, physical presence near the data center facility. So that for sure impacts the geographic part of your ideal client profile and whether or not you could expand based on these additional capabilities. By the way, for a traditional professional services firm, channel provider, like if you think of the first cousins of an integrator being like a consultancy or an MSP, a managed service provider, or a VAR, a value-added reseller, it's actually quite common that part of the way that a company like that expands its geographic footprint is through third-party service providers in marketplaces that it just can't get an immediate presence to. Like, say, for example, you're an integrator that's headquartered in London and you want to do business in Manchester, but you don't have any employees or physical presence in Manchester. And it's a little bit of a train ride or car ride to get there. So you might partner with a third-party service provider who fills that capability. Let's say, for example, you're in Los Angeles and you want to be able to expand your presence throughout Southern California, and you don't have anyone that lives near San Diego or has an office near San Diego. Well, you might partner to be able to provide coverage throughout Southern California, throughout Orange County and down into San Diego. And this example you could trace throughout not only your region, but nationally, throughout multi-countries, throughout multiple continents. Very, very common to find companies that have a beachhead in a particular market, like, for example, in Europe or in the US or something like that, and their initial foothold into additional geographic expansion usually starts with third-party service providers. So for creating this visibility and opportunity, it's not like all of a sudden you're going to have a event with vendor tables where you want your clients to be going direct to your third-party service providers. In most cases, you're looking for a white label kind of relationship, private label, whatever you want to call it. Usually it's called white label kind of service. So they're an extension of your team. You maybe even in some cases literally give the techs who go on site for you your shirts to wear when they're on site at clients. So it looks like a seamless extension of your team and your brand. But in terms of creating that additional visibility and opportunity, it's usually a matter of understanding the biggest goals and challenges of your core buyer personas and figuring out if all of a sudden these additional third-party service providers give you additional capabilities, additional kinds of problems that you could tackle. And that may cause you to want to build out some additional campaigns that introduce these additional service capabilities. Usually that would be more mid-funnel to bottom of the funnel, where the buyer persona's core goals and challenges are more like early stage, awareness stage, top of the funnel. It could also come into play with these third-party service capabilities as a post-purchase, as a account management function, as a client success function for like upselling, cross-selling, account expansion. And again, in most scenarios, most of the data center integrators that I've worked with over the past couple of decades would typically have the preference for that single point of contact, and their third-party service providers as contractors, as subcontractors, independent contractors, whatever you want to call it, are usually a little more behind the scenes. So creating the visibility isn't necessarily for these companies, it's for the capabilities that these companies' talent represents. And the way that would be manifested is by all of a sudden having some additional areas where you'd want to create lead magnets like downloadable reports and ebooks and planning guides, or some assessment tools for your website, or additional topics to cover as part of your webinar program, as part of your other educational events like your breakfast seminar, lunch and learn webinar programs, podcasting programs, email nurturing, email newsletter. That's really where I think the visibility and the biggest opportunities are going to come into play. Because, like, for example, in the example that I used before, where, like, say as an integrator, you've never been able to get deep into environmental monitoring or DSIM or cybersecurity or whatever it is. And all of a sudden now with these additional third-party service provider contractor capabilities, you have those capabilities. It would likely make sense to your monthly webinar program. You have 12 topics that you're covering over the course of the year. You maybe decide, okay, for next year's program, 9 or 10 of those topics are going to come from big goals and challenges that we know are that each buyer persona has. And we're going to reserve 2 or 3 of those slots for creating educational awareness for what we think some of the hottest areas are, the biggest areas of demand, where our third-party service providers could plug in with unique problem-solving expertise that's especially top of mind for this specific kind of buyer persona. So do I think that most integrators are going to lead with these capabilities? Probably not, but it becomes a really important part of share of bigger wallet, retaining account control, again, account expansion, cross-selling, upselling. And it's highly likely that most of this kind of content, most of this kind of email, most of these kinds of social posts, most of this kind of webinar events kind of strategy is slotted into more mid to bottom of the funnel, mid to later stage of the journey, more in the consideration to decision stage of the journey, unless all of a sudden you're setting up these partnerships with the idea that you may look to eventually acquire one or more of these firms through M&A. We know in technology services, mergers and acquisitions, roll-ups are a really hot area. So maybe that's part of the concerted strategy. But again, in the case of an integrator, it's very unlikely that you're linking directly to their site, that you're putting them out there on a vendor fair, that you're making them a core part of the stuff. If your clients really want that single point of contact, the single proposal, the single agreement, the single invoice, the single phone call, the single support portal. And with that in mind, again, it's usually understanding what unique talents and that service provider brings to the table and how that maps to goals and challenges that have already been very well articulated for your focused primary and secondary buyer persona. As a cautionary note, be really, really careful to make sure that just because you have these capabilities, that you put them front and center without taking into account your ideal client profile and your primary and secondary buyer personas, because that can take you into a completely different business, and it can be a complete disconnect to your efforts to actually be client-centric and to really walk a mile or a kilometer in the shoes of your most important clients and really understand what's going on in their world. It's very possible that some of these third-party service provider capabilities map to a different set of buyer personas than you currently have today. And if you try to talk to CTOs like they're financial executives, or you try to talk to financial executives like they're sales leaders, or you try to talk to sales leaders like they're engineers, or you try to talk to engineers like they're DevOps people, like they'll care about different things. So it's really super important in the world of immediate gratification and self-driven buyer's journey, where nearly all of the research and comparing options and consideration is happening without you in the room. It's incredibly important to get really dialed into what's top of mind for your most buyer personas. So again, with this question, how an integrator can create better visibility and opportunity for third-party service providers, it's really, really important to address that strategy with thinking for where we are today as opposed to where we were 10 years ago. Where we were 10 years ago, it was very likely that a data center integrator sales team was still looped into these conversations for half of the buyer's journey, for half of the sales cycle. Back 10 years ago, a very common research point that people talked about was 57% of a typical buyer's journey was over before vendor contact, before sales contact. That was CEB, the Corporate Executive Board, that's now owned by Gartner. So if you did everything right, you were still in there for the final 43% of the research and decision-making process. However, that's now very much a point of nostalgia. It's very, very rare for sales professionals to be in there for half of the time anymore, unless they're in there early and often as teachers, subject matter experts, consultants, trusted advisors, subject matter experts. That's what we talk about a lot. For most data center integrators, unless they're extremely well-positioned, extremely differentiated, they're going to be locked out of the first 83% of the buyer's journey. They're only going to be in there, even if they do everything right, for the final 17%. That's Gartner's latest research on B2B tech buyer preferences. The research, 83% of research and comparing options and evaluating pricing now happens in a self-service fashion. So with this in mind, it is so incredibly important to be client-centric. And instead of trying to show up as an integrator, as a vendor that's trying to push your stuff, it's way more important to show up as a teacher, as a consultant, as a trusted advisor, as a subject matter expert who's educating and building trust with your most important buyer personas. And instead of them thinking that they're spending time with the vendor, you're part of their professional development. You're part of their learning and development process. And the better job you do with this, the better job it works for your entire business, including creating visibility and opportunity, both for your core internal team and your third-party service providers. So that's the key with all of this, is to get as client-centric as possible, understand and respect how much buyer preferences have changed, and make sure that you're delivering so much value that your most important prospects and clients want to spend a lot of time with the smartest people on your team, with your subject matter experts, learning and growing and proactively driving alignment about their biggest goals and their biggest challenges that you know about because you've done your homework, because you've done diligent customer insight research. So that's what a data center integrator should be thinking about when it comes to creating visibility and opportunity for their third-party service providers. If you're getting great value from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you help to spread the word by hitting the like button on whatever platform that you're watching on. So what's up next? What's our next question that we're going to be addressing today? Okay, so the next question that we're going to be addressing today is from the data center operator part of the data center ecosystem. And the question is, how do we market and sell co-location and managed services in data center facilities? How do we market and sell co-location and managed services in data center facilities? I love this question because this is an area that I've been working on with clients for probably at least 12 or 15 years at this point. I actually first learned about colocation data centers in the early 2010s as a byproduct of working with managed service providers, MSPs, and VARs, value-added resellers, for the previous 12, 15 years before that, on a variety of business development, sales, marketing, partnering, subcontracting kinds of challenges with rethinking their business models. And what I saw is in the early 2010s, as a lot of those companies were trying to transition from a client-centric premise-based world to a world where SaaS, software as a service, public cloud was becoming a lot more dominant, I saw a lot of those companies really struggling with their business model because so much of their revenue, so much of the profitability was tied to hardware refresh cycles. And it was especially challenging for a lot of these entrepreneurial MSP integrator VARs that were 20, 25 years into their business that launched in the golden heyday of client server back in the day when PCs and LANs and Novell NetWare and Windows NT and Microsoft Small Business Server. So many of these managed service provider business owners, by the time we were in the 2010s, were already probably in their 40s and 50s and starting to think about eventually succession planning and retirement. And this was like a lot of cold water in their face to figure out what to do next. And for all of those folks globally that were facing these kinds of challenges, the ones that were figuring it out were generally going in one of three directions. I saw some of those kinds of companies moving out of SMB, out of small and medium-sized business, and moving more up market into working more with mid-market and to a certain degree enterprise clients, usually more mid-market. And they were specializing in something that was very well primed for their bench of talent or expertise. In a lot of cases, it was ERP, enterprise resource planning, or something very similar to that, where they still could have decent margin, decent differentiation. They weren't as badly commoditized as they were becoming with their core hardware-centric, product-centric reselling business. So about a third of them were moving mid-market up into ERP. Another third were becoming custom software developers. They were building web apps and building mobile apps. And then a final third were going all in, going very deep on infrastructure. And I got to work in all three of those categories, but what I love the most and where I've spent most of my career is more on the infrastructure as a service side. So how this would play out typically as an MSP that was serving as fractional CTO, fractional CIO for their clients, their small and medium-sized business clients, would take a server or two and they place this in a co-location facility and they would rent out slices of that server, pieces of that server, to their fractional CTO, their outsourced IT clients. And this worked pretty well in the early days. Or in some cases, those clients would come back from an industry conference, like they'd be at a manufacturing conference or a hospitality conference. And again, these were non-technical, non-IT people. So they'd be like the owner of a small business, the CFO of a small business, the COO, the head of sales. It was typically the person that was a little more technical than everyone else on the company. We used to call them the internal computer guru. So because of that, they were the liaison. They were the main point of contact with the outside IT company. So that person, they'd go to an industry conference and they'd come back and they'd say, gee, fractional CTO, I have no idea what this means, but I went to this great breakout session and we were told we need to co-locate a server. You know what co-locating a server means, right? You'd be like, oh yeah, of course we know what co-locating a server. They wouldn't know what co-locating, the client wouldn't know what co-locating a server. They just knew that as part of what they wanted to do with this hospitality app or this manufacturing app, that they needed to have space to run this software in a co-location facility. So that was my first introduction into co-location data centers. And for the first couple of years, I understood the technology part of the ecosystem well. Eventually, I got to learn more about the facility side and construction and real estate and investment. And today, all 57 different business models that DCSMI tracks within data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. But yeah, that was the first connecting of the dots that I saw with managed service providers, MSPs, and co-location data centers. Fast forward to where we are today, you find there's typically two different kinds of co-location providers. There's co-location providers that are very real estate centric, that are focusing on like just really the lease, the tenant relationship. They're kind of selling space and power and access to connectivity in their data center as if they were running a co-working space for servers. like as if they were a sales director for like WeWork or Regis or a big co-working space, and they're renting out spaces, slices, either cabinets or racks, partial racks to their or suites to their co-location clients. Very, very real estate centric. And then there's co-location providers that believe they're a lot more in the IT services business, and they tend to either provide a certain baseline amount of IT services in their core agreements, or they make those available as productized add-ons, or they do custom services, or they bring in experts as an extension of what they do, but they're very focused on not just the real estate, but the entire IT services solutions. And interestingly enough, most of the clients that I've worked with in the last couple of years, most of the companies that I've hosted interviews with on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast skew more towards the IT services side. I think there is a reason. I think typically the companies that are in co-location and heavily involved in managed services tend to be more profitable. They tend to be more growth oriented. They tend to be more focused on differentiation, competitive positioning. They understand educating and building trust. They have great content marketing, thought leadership programs. Some of them even have their own podcasting and webinar programs. So yeah, it's a much more natural fit that they're building their brand in a very deliberate way, leaning into the self-driven buyer's journey, recognizing that they're very cynical buyers of IT services are more sales allergic than they've ever been in the past. And it's super important to earn their way back in early and often by being seen as a trusted advisor, not just someone who's trying to sell them co-location space. So with that context in mind, how do we market and sell co-location and managed services in data center facilities? I think there's two different ways, two different parts of the business model here. Again, there's the real estate focus, there's the IT services focused. And then I think there's also a split between small co-location operators that are running 1, 2, or 3 facilities, and mid-sized co-location operators that have a handful or 2 of facilities, 5 or 10, 15 different facilities. And then the massive global data center operators that have dozens of different facilities. The global co-location data center operators that have dozens of different facilities that are billion-dollar businesses, many of which are publicly traded real estate investment trusts, they're playing a different go-to-market game than everyone else because their brand equity is so ridiculously powerful that it's basically the modern day version of, if you ever heard the expression back in the day of nobody ever get fired for buying IBM, fill in the blank with global or big national data center operator. On many levels, people perceive, or certain kinds of people perceive, that that is the safe choice. And as a result, a lot of the way that you do marketing and demand generation and nurturing sales territory, segmentation, all of that is very, very different. Most of the companies that are going to be most enjoying the kind of content that we produce at DCSMI and on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast usually don't sit at the top of that perch, because if they do, typically their employers have very prescriptive books on what they can, playbooks on what they can and can't do. And they've arrived at the company when the SDR, when the BDR, when the account manager, when the solutions engineer playbook is on version 117, and there's relatively little flexibility to customize it. Their territory is typically carved out geographically and potentially by client size, and almost certainly by industry and product line. It's a lot more highly specialized. And mid-size operators and small co-location operators, there's more opportunity, more flexibility. In many cases, the small to mid-size operators are winning opportunities because companies have went to the big guys and they didn't like what they saw. They thought it was too inflexible. They wanted a more direct relationship with members of the company's executive team. They wanted more of a stake in what was coming and understanding what's in the roadmap and what's coming in the roadmap, more flexibility, a host of related reasons on why a particular client would prefer a small to mid-size option as opposed to one of the huge global options. So different kinds of playbooks for marketing and selling the colo and the managed services and data center facilities. in most cases across the board, nearly all would benefit from getting a lot more client-centric, really dialing in what that ideal client profile is geographically, where these perfect clients are, how big or small they are, and in terms of size, like what's the minimum headcount, minimum number of employees they need to have to be a good fit for your minimums. At the upper end of the range, at what point does a particular client get so large that they're looking for service capabilities and requirements and financial and legal type of integration type of things that you just can't deliver today as a company. So knowing that range, the company size range in your ICP, is a really big deal. Also being self-aware of the kinds of industries where you can play really well and the kinds where you'd really struggle a lot. Because for a co-location company, for a managed service provider company, where in a particular geographic region, you're often dealing with some kind of compliance requirements or accreditation requirements, certification requirements, where if you have those, fantastic. That's a core part of the inclusions in your ideal client profile. If you do not have a particular certification or accreditation that you know a certain kind of client wants, that also needs to be mentioned in your ideal client profile, but as an exclusion. So when you're setting up your filtering, whether it's an outbound campaign, whether it's an ad campaign, whether it's a drop-down list on a web lead generation form, whether it's filters or lists or queries sitting in your customer relationship management, your CRM system, all benefit tremendously from having a really good handle on the industries to include explicitly and exclude explicitly. And a lot of it, again, comes down to the intersection of where you're located and a particular prospect, particular clients' kinds of business models. In addition to that, there also is a different marketing and sales playbook for co-location and managed services that comes up depending on whether you're doing hyper-local marketing or doing long distance, more virtual, more digital kinds of marketing. Where that tends to be a factor is, believe it or not, even in the time and era where we are, where co-location's been around for, at this point, 20, 25 years, there still is very, very strong geographic proximity preferences among most of your prospects and clients, meaning that they still want to hug the server. They still want to be able to know that they can drive and get to your facility relatively quickly from their office or home office, or a little bit of both. And sure, they also take into account governance issues, where the server is physically located. They're for sure going to take into account latency requirements. They're going to take into account business continuity, disaster recovery kinds of requirements. But proximity to where that IT team is located, or where those IT teams are located, in addition to where the clients are located, in addition to where the end users are located, still is a really big deal. So with that in mind, when it comes to your marketing and sales playbook, there's a local and a long distance version. For most companies that want to really grow and differentiate their managed services and co-location business, the local version looks something like this: understanding your ideal client profile, the tight geographic location where they are relative to that 30 or 60-minute drive of your facility, how big or small those clients are, the industries they tend to be located in. From that ICP, from that ideal client profile, you should be able to build out your target account list, couple dozen, couple hundred, maybe a few thousand, depending on where you're located, of potential companies that you'd love to do business with. That usually gets divvied up among your sales team. And then you figure out your prioritized buyer personas, your segmentation strategy, of who's the most important economic stakeholder for that kind of client, who's the second most important kind of stakeholder for that economic buyer who's on the decision committee for that kind of client. And then once you have that primary and secondary, doing your homework, doing your research to understand each of those personas' biggest goals and challenges. So let's say, for argument's sake, for each of those personas, there's 5 or 6 big goals, 5 or 6 big challenges. So in aggregate, you end up with about 10 or 12 topics that are top of mind that you've learned about from them in their own words. That's the key part. It's got to be in their own words. And in their own words, that research is what you use going forward for everything. Your website copywriting, when you put together a dedicated website page, and some real estate on your homepage and some real estate on your website navigation for that particular buyer persona. That buyer persona research, in addition to the website copywriting, drives your lead generation and your lead nurturing strategy, like what your premium content should look like, what your webinars should look like, what your lunch and learn, what your breakfast seminars should look like that are in your facility, email marketing, social media, digital ads, all of the above, honing in on the words, the goals, the challenges that are top of mind for each one of those segments. And for the hyper-local playbook, I'm especially partial for getting those prospects and clients to visit your facility. So we know there's 10 or 12 topics, 5 or 6 big goals, 5 or 6 big challenges that they care about. Those are your 10 or 12 topics to cover in your monthly breakfast seminar series, in your monthly lunch and learn series that you invite your primary buyer persona to. You do a separate series for your secondary buyer persona. They potentially care about quite different goals and challenges, right? And the cool part is, relative to what you may already be investing, participating in massive national and global conferences, this is really, really much more logistically simple and certainly way, way, way less expensive. And because of that, you can run these a lot more frequently. And the cool part is, if you already have a conference room or a classroom or a foyer that can comfortably sit 10, 15, 20 people, it costs next to nothing to run these events. You're inviting people in for breakfast. What does it cost in your budget to bring in bagels, pastry, a little bit of fruit, and some coffee? You're bringing them in for lunch. What does it cost to bring in deli or pizza or whatever to have a little bit of hospitality for 15, 20 people? Nothing compared to the cost of bringing your team to a big national and global conference and looking for the needle in the haystack among the thousands of people that are attending. The cool part, when it's your own events, you get to decide who's invited. It's your target account list. It's their top of mind topic that you know the consensus on, that they care about. And when you do a really good job with this, the cool part is when you suggest that, hey, when it comes to cybersecurity for mid-market manufacturing companies in our region, we know it takes a village. There's typically people involved from operations, support, help desk, finance, compliance. So with that in mind, who else from your team would benefit from attending our upcoming breakfast seminar? Simply hit the forward button in this email, add a phrase or two on why this matters, and recommend that your colleagues, we recommend also that your colleagues can benefit from attending as well, because we know that teams that learn together, grow together, and do better together in achieving their goals. And the cool part is, when this is working, you look down at your registration lists, wherever you're hosting this in your CRM or whatever, and you're like, cool, like there's 5 or 6 people out of the 30 that registered from the exact same company. What does that mean? They're talking about us. We're getting alignment. And even if we can only get half of those attending, we now have 2 or 3 people from the same company learning and growing with us, that we're getting a chance to educate and build trust with, that we're getting a chance to expose to our best practices and methodologies, and getting to shape the criteria that they're going to use going forward. So this isn't just getting you on the short list. It's controlling the short list in a way that you stay on the short list to the end, and you're starting to proactively bump other options off of the short list because they keep wanting to come back and learn more and more from you. And don't be surprised when you get to event number 2, event number 3, event number 4, that you start to see more people from the same company coming together, where all of a sudden you're like, our room only holds 20 people and there's 8 people from the same company. And they approach you and they're like, we have a lot of people from our company. Why don't you just come on site next week? We're having an all hands meeting and you can present this to our whole company. Like, that would be awesome. That's your trusted advisor relationship. That's your subject matter expert relationship. That's the golden foot in the door that you're looking for. And of course, in terms of logistics, if it starts at 8:30, you can have breakfast and a little bit of networking starting at 8. You do your formal program, educating and building trust with conference-grade content that's so good that if they flew across the country to the other part of the continent, the other part of the world to learn from you, they would agree that your content knocked it out of the park in terms of value. Following your 30 or 45-minute talk, open it up for 10 or 20 minutes of Q&A for anyone that wants to. After that, take them on a tour around your facility. Lather, rinse, repeat. Magical things start to happen with pipeline generation. Now, what about the long-distance clients that want a presence in your co-location facility but can't get there easily in 30 or 60 minutes? Well, you take the exact same persona research. You take the exact same slides, the great content, and instead of delivering this in your conference room on the TV with people having some great breakfast or lunch along with this, you deliver it on a webinar program. So for all of the people on the other side of the country, for all the people on the other side of the world that are looking for a data center facility like yours that can't get there, deliver this virtually. And in both cases, both the in-person event and the virtual event, by all means, record it. There's always going to be, you're never going to get 100% attendance rate. So there's always going to be coworkers, bosses, other team members that should have been there, where multiple people approach you afterwards and, can we get the recording? I want to share this with others on our team. Absolutely, here's the recording. And then there's going to be people that fully intend to watch the full 45-minute recording, but for whatever reason, they get distracted. So if you're covering 5 best practices, well, chop that up into 5 shorter videos, and you have 5 shorter videos, and you have 5 blog posts. And you can take those and chop them up into shorts for the people that really have ADD, where you can get them to watch 93 seconds or 37 seconds from that. And you have a bunch of clips that you can share on YouTube Shorts and LinkedIn to completely dominate and have a really, really client-centric, really proactive way of educating and building trust with that particular buyer persona. So that's the basic playbook that most companies should be using to market and sell co-location and managed services in their data center facilities. When is it time to bring up co-location versus managed services? Start with where they are. Start with what they care about, their biggest goals and challenges. The idea of talking specifically about co-location and managed services may not be on their top 5 list or even their top 10 list for a leading indicator of who's a great client. But there will always be a natural way to segue into that, partly through some or all of these programs. That's maybe more consideration and decision. There are certain kinds of buyer personas where co-location and managed services is your top of mind, top of the funnel awareness stage topic, but that may end up being a tertiary buyer persona, like when you have relationships with other managed service providers who are more, they don't need you to necessarily teach them about topic X, but they're very interested specifically in your capabilities around that. So again, know the room, read the room, know the customer insight, customize everything that you're doing for what they care about, not what you want them to care about, but what you know that they care about because you did your homework. So that's how I would approach how to market and sell co-location and managed services in data center facilities. Okay, what's up next? If you're enjoying what we're covering so far, make sure to smash the like button to help spread the word. What do we have up next? Okay, so how does a data center operations optimization consultancy bridge the knowledge gap between industries? How does a data center ops optimization consultancy bridge the knowledge gap between industries? So a consultancy is a type of professional services firm. In the case of operations optimization, this is usually supplementing or potentially taking the place of, or a little bit of both, the need for a data center operator or end user with its own data centers to hire a bigger data center operations team. So they're either outsourcing this optimization to your consulting firm, or they're supplementing their internal capabilities, or a little bit of both. So you're wondering how to bridge this knowledge gap between industries. Okay, so what that tells us is so a data center operations optimization consultancy usually tends to be a little more tech heavy, more on the IT side of the data center ecosystem, but may also have some involvement on the facility side. Usually, first and foremost, when people think of like network operations and data center operations, it's a little more heavy on the IT side as opposed to on the facility side. But either way, it really depends on the size of your firm and what you're choosing to specialize in. The fact that you're bringing up these knowledge gaps between industries tells me that you're getting a lot of very, very specific requests that in some cases you can handle, some cases you can't. So for an operations optimization consultancy with bridging the gap between industries, I'd first get really specific about what these industries actually are. Let's go back to the basics and make sure your ideal client profile is in good shape. So If it's not, the way we typically build it is look at your public facing website, your public facing decks, how you present yourself, which companies are the logos, which are the testimonials, which are the case studies, and what do those companies have in common in terms of geographically where they're located, how big or small they are, and what industries do they tend to be within. Now, operations, if you're doing on the technology side, it's possible you're doing initial site surveys, some initial installation, but you may be able to do a lot of this remotely. Over time, I think we're going to continue to see with agentic AI, we're going to continue to see more and more of this being done remotely with relatively few humans doing operations in the data center facilities. But with where we are right now for bridging the knowledge gap across industries, a lot of this is a combination of focusing your go-to-market playbook, focusing what you're doing with how you explain this on your website. In other words, like for an operations optimization consultancy, if you have like a who we help section on your homepage, a who we help section on your top and bottom navigation, more than likely, because you're asking this question about industries, you probably have or probably should have a page for each of these industries, like telecommunications, healthcare, financial services, manufacturing, wherever you have this kind of expertise. And on that page, you'll typically talk about what the biggest goals and challenges are relative to optimizing data center operations for that specific industry. You'll know about this through a combination of work that you've done with prospects and clients that are in that industry and doing buyer persona research on the biggest goals and challenges from that. That website page more than likely should be supplemented with its own unique lead generation strategy for the top, middle, and bottom of the funnel to intentionally generate leads and continue to nurture those leads throughout the journey. So let's say you have those 4 different pages. What do we say? Telecommunications, manufacturing, healthcare, and financial services. So now your concern really, are we bridging the knowledge gap with your prospects and clients, or are we bridging the knowledge gap with your own team members? Critical distinction there, right? But it may be that you want to have a common base of knowledge, both internally and externally. And in that case, going all in on educating and building trust and having a fantastic webinar program, having fantastic premium content, educational resources is not only incredibly valuable for cross-training, for upskilling your own internal team members, but versions of this should be relatively easy to repurpose into public-facing versions of this as well for your prospects and clients in these particular industries. Now, if you do not have deep enough expertise in one or more of these verticals and one or more of these industries to be the subject matter expert that can produce these amazingly helpful educational resources, then typically the way most professional services firms, most consulting firms would bridge this is by interviewing other subject matter experts. These could be contractors, subcontractors, independent contractors that you already work with. It could be companies that you have partner relationships with. It could be vendor relationships with. Basically, it's a supplement to, in addition to the executives, in addition to the principals within your company, in addition to full-time employees within your company, these are additional subject matter experts. And many times these can be fantastic for bridging some of these knowledge gaps. And this would get baked into like podcast interviews, webinar panels, in-person panels, and then repurposed a whole bunch of different ways. So that's on the education and trust building. In terms of delivering the actual data center operations optimization consultancy services, it's kind of exactly what I just alluded to, is if all of a sudden you have those 4 practice areas really well covered and you lose your expert on optimizing operations in manufacturing centric data centers, well, okay, well, you have a talent problem now. How are you going to fill that talent problem? Are you going to go out and hire another employee? Are you going to hire a consultant? Are you going to do a little bit of both? And that would be the same strategy if you decide that you want to expand into another area. Let's say, in addition to those 4 areas, you feel that you're not spread too thin and can add a 5th area. And you decide maybe that 5th area is going to be automotive or oil and gas or defense or space or something like that. So regardless of what that area is, and again, the more deeply niched you go, the more likely it is that you're talking about companies that have their own data centers as opposed to data center operators, because data center operators are certainly distinctly different from telecommunications, but probably more closely related to telecommunications than some of the other verticals. So yeah, if one of your core top 3, top 4 industries or verticals that you specialize in is being fantastic with data center operators, that should be its own Who We Help page. It should have its own button or its own real estate on your homepage. It should be in the top nav. It should be in the bottom navigation of your website. It should be in the drop-down lists on your lead generation forms. It should be in the filtering segmentation criteria in your CRM system. And you may find you even subspecialize. Maybe within data center operators, you've done really well with co-location, but you've really struggled with hyperscale. Well, it's important to know that as well. Every ICP, every ideal client profile strategy benefits from having inclusions as well as exclusions. So in that particular case, one of your verticals would be data center infrastructure companies, data center operators, synonym for that are principally involved in co-location, but not principally involved in hyperscale, or principally involved in co-location and edge, and not principally involved in hyperscale. And again, your results will vary. Maybe you decide to specialize. Here would be a really interesting area that probably is very smaller market, but probably not very crowded, is what about a data center operations optimization consultancy specializing in modular data centers? Ooh. Probably not very crowded. So again, this is a strategy. This is business model. This is probably in a smaller company getting decided by your CEO and your executive leadership team. But those are some of the considerations that I'd think about if you're serious about bridging the knowledge gap between industries as a data center operations optimization consulting firm. So that's how a data center operations optimization consultancy can bridge the knowledge gap between industries. We got 3 more questions coming up for you in the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. But in the meantime, here's a real quick word from our sponsor.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com. Now, back to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A.
Hey there, Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and you are tuned into this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. We're thrilled to have you with us. If you're enjoying this week's show so far, make sure that you hit the like button to help spread the word. And if you have an idea for a topic, a question, or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're tuning in from. So next question. Today's show is how a co-location backup solutions and data security provider can get SMB clients. How a co-location backup solutions and data security provider can get SMB, small and medium-sized business clients. That is a terrific question. And when it comes to a company that provides co-location, backup solutions, and data center and data security, they're basically bridging the data center operator part of the data center ecosystem and a little bit of the data center technology part of the ecosystem, because it is possible to sell backup and data security without being in the co-location business, right? So, and it is possible to be a co-location provider that doesn't provide backup solutions and data security and lets their clients figure that out for themselves. But you've decided that you want to be in all 3 of these businesses, and you're going to focus on small and medium-sized businesses that would benefit a lot from the single point of contact of having a single relationship, a single invoice, a single point of contact, single point of accountability for co-location and data backup and data security, which is fantastic. So as a co-location operator that's getting involved in providing some of this IT software and this IT services, it's super important to be very deliberate about the kind of SMB clients that you work with. And usually over time, as you get to product market fit, knowing exactly who the ideal clients are, the products and services they purchase from you, the price points, the frequency, the sales cycle length, the margins, all of the basic unit economics. As you get into good pattern recognition there, you'll almost certainly start to see that manifest itself across your testimonials, your reviews, your case studies, your logos on your website, and that'll feed directly into your ideal client profile for these small and medium-sized business clients, because not all SMB clients are created equal. For a lot of companies that are involved in co-location and data backup and data security, it's actually quite common to say, well, no, not all SMB clients. Well, what do you mean by not all SMB clients? Where usually when they're using SMB, there's really, for starters, there's no real industry definition as to what the top of SMB actually is. For some government agencies, for some market research firms, they'll stop the top of SMB at 200 employees and mid-market starts at 200. Some of them will stop at 500 employees and the bottom of mid-market starts at 500. Again, your results will vary, but almost certainly over time, you should see some pattern recognition of the client sizes that are big enough to afford to invest aggressively in what you offer, but not so big that they outgrow you. And along the same lines, what that usually factors into is the employee headcount range, the company size range. That's a really good fit for your company's colo, backup, and data security. So in that ideal client profile, typically with co-location, most of your clients are going to have very strong proximity preference for where they place their server relative to where they're located. Alternatively, maybe 20% of the clients are actually the opposite, meaning they're nowhere near your colo facility. They can't drive there in a 30 or 60 minute time frame, but they're picking your particular location, your facility's location, because it needs to be there for governance reasons or business continuity reasons or latency reasons. And that's kind of your long distance playbook of those SMB clients. But usually when it comes to a colo provider going after SMB clients, first and foremost, they're usually thinking of the lower hanging fruit of strong community building relationships and with local small and medium-sized business owners. Now, depending on whether you're in a secondary or tertiary market with a smaller market size or a bigger major metro market, you may decide that your ideal client profile goes across all industries as opposed to being specialized in a handful of industries. And this also manifests itself not only based on how big your geographic area is, how many potential clients there are in your geographic area. This will also industry compliance requirements, accreditation requirements could also come into play. Like, for example, in certain regions of the world, you need certain credentials to be able to be a data center operator for financial services, for healthcare, for government. So if you have those, great. That's a natural part of your ICP, your ideal client profile for these small and medium-sized business clients. If you don't have those, well, you should probably make sure that you're not wasting time and resources educating and building trust with clients that you just can't practically serve right now. So knowing where they're located, knowing how big or small these SMB clients are, and knowing their industries is incredibly important. Oh, going back to the size for a moment as well. A lot of data center operators, both the executives and the sales teams, frequently, when they have a lead generation campaign that didn't go well, they a lot of times complain about the clients being too small to afford their services. So for sure, once you know that, I mean, you know your minimums, right? You know what your minimum level of engagement is, you know what your minimum packages are, you know your minimum length of duration, and over time you'll figure out how big a client needs to be to actually afford your entry-level co-location, backup, and data protection, data security kind of offering. And with that in mind, you may decide that the floor is they need to have at least 10 employees. Maybe you decide they have to have at least 50 employees. Again, your results will vary depending on your company size, their company size, whether you're in a major like primary market versus a secondary or tertiary market, whether you're specializing in verticals or going horizontal. But again, I want you to think long and hard about where they're located, how big or small those companies are, and specific niches or industries that you want to go after. And once you have figured that out, I want you to look at like your top 10 or 20 most profitable long-term clients and figure out like which ones you want to clone, which ones you'd love to copy and paste. Because that's essentially what's going to help you figure out what companies should go on your target account list based on the criteria that you've already figured out with your ideal client profile. And it's also going to help you prioritize your segmentation and personalization strategy, your buyer personas on who the most important economic decision maker is, who's the second most important economic decision maker. In small co-location operators that have modestly sized sales teams, modestly sized internal marketing, they may not have much internal marketing at all. It's actually very common to find that they just really have two different kinds of buyer personas. They have like a small business owner who's looking for outsourced digital infrastructure, co-location in a data center facility, because if they're really small, there probably isn't even a full-time IT executive. If they're going a little bit bigger, if they start to go up to like a couple dozen employees or 50 plus employees, yeah, there will almost certainly be some kind of full-time or small IT team in place, in which case that may be your primary and your secondary is the owner, or vice versa. Typically in small companies, the beautiful part with small companies is everyone knows each other. The downside with smaller companies is they tend to have smaller budgets. But it's very likely that if you're inviting a small business owner to your upcoming breakfast seminar series on cybersecurity for mid-market manufacturing companies in your region, it's very likely that when you encourage the owner to attend, of course, and when you say who else should attend, of course, they're going to want to bring their IT person along with them. It's not a big stretch to get from person A to point B in a company with a couple dozen employees. The downside is with a couple dozen employees, they don't have as big of a budget, other things being equal, as larger companies. That's the reason why when you're selling to small, medium-sized business, you typically don't need a super granular buyer persona segmentation strategy, because people tend to wear a lot of hats. Everyone tends to know everyone else. And usually the most common split among a small single location or 2 or 3 location co-location operator is there's like the business owner or the IT executive, which could be split up into, but usually you're splitting hairs in a really small company. And the secondary buyer persona is a channel partner, like a managed service provider who often cares about very different issues than the end client. So that would be one of the core splits, is really understanding the goals and challenges of that primary buyer persona, of that secondary buyer persona, and using that customer insight for your website copywriting, your email marketing program, your email newsletter, your social posts, your digital ad strategy, everything that you do with lead generation, everything that you do with event marketing, both in-person events and potentially virtual digital events, is focusing really on the 5 or 6 biggest goals, 5 or 6 biggest challenges that each of those segments have, one at a time, and educating and building trust over and over and over again. I often talk about the idea of early and often. In a self-driven buyer's journey, where most of your prospects and clients are more sales allergic than they've ever been, they're going to go really, really deep into research and decision making before they're open to talking with someone from your team. Gartner's latest research puts that number all the way at 83%, meaning that even if you do everything perfectly, you're typically only in on the final 17% of their research and decision-making process. And the only way that we're going to get you back in for that 83%, to have significant surface area to earn a seat on their side of the table, is we got to get you in there as a teacher, consultant, a subject matter expert, a trusted advisor, maybe even a thought leader when it comes to anything and everything having to do with co-location and backup and data security for a small and medium-sized business just like theirs in that particular job role. And the better job you do with earning your way in early and often with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context, so they see your client-facing team members as some of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to their kind of business and addressing needs around digital infrastructure that are a leading indicator that they're going to be in market for co-location, data backup, data protection in the coming weeks and in the coming months. Early and often is incredibly important. This is not one and done. That's why I encourage you, once you know about the 10 or 12 top of mind topics, the 5 or 6 big goals, the 5 or 6 big challenges, once a month, host that breakfast seminar or that lunch and learn or that webinar or all of the above. Early and often, getting multiple stakeholders from the same company to attend and learn together is incredibly important for proactively driving alignment, indoctrinating, sharing your best practices, teaching them what to look for to find the perfect co-location, backup, and data security provider for their kind of company. So that's what I would focus on early and often, educating and building trust, having them come to events in your facility. If they're long distance, that 20% that's buying long distance co-location for disaster recovery or latency or governance reasons, yeah, you can repurpose the same content and run that as webinars. But the goal for most of your bread and butter clients is to get in and have them come in and break bread and butter with you, or bagels and cream cheese, or pastries and fruit, or pizza, or deli, whatever you're doing. Them come into your facility, have some lunch, have some breakfast, learn for 30 or 45 minutes, get to ask your experts some questions for 10 or 20 minutes, offer to take them on a tour afterwards, and beautiful things will start to happen with educating and building trust for those most important buyer personas in your target accounts. So that's what I'd recommend as the core basic strategy. It's not terribly complicated. After you do it a couple times, it'll become a lot more natural. Once you start to see the results coming in, you'll kick yourself that you didn't start doing this a couple of years earlier. And compared to the cost of dragging your team to national and global conferences, this is a fraction of the cost and so much more effective, because you get to pick who's invited and what you talk about and the timing, and you pretty much control everything. It's awesome. Do it. Learn to get better at it. It is a really, really powerful engine for getting SMB clients for a co-location backup solutions and data security provider. If you're enjoying this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure to help spread the word by hitting the like button on whatever platform that you're watching from. And if you haven't already told us, be sure to let us know what you do in the data center industry. We'd love to know. Okay, what do we got? Next question. How does a data center design, construction, and management firm market and sell data center solutions? So it's interesting. This question is in the construction and real estate part of the data center ecosystem. And again, as you probably can tell if you've been at our data center go-to-market sales and marketing Q&A shows a couple of times, the questions tend to skew a little more heavier towards operations, technology, and facility. There's just more people working in those parts of the industry. There's more business models. You get 5 different operators, 22 different kinds of tech companies, a dozen different kinds of facilities companies. So there's 42 of the 57 business models are concentrated in operators, technology, and facilities. But construction, real estate, and investment is a really important part of that as well, because so much of the capital, so much starts there. So this particular question, this is for a company that's principally in the business of design, construction, and management that is marketing their data center solution. So with a data center design, data center construction, data center management firm, you're controlling a big part of the life cycle of the data center. And for smaller firms, it's actually very common to find specializing in just one of those areas. There's a lot of data center design / architecture firms that just do that, and they do a fantastic job. There are a lot of data center construction firms, general contractor firms that do a fantastic job with that, and they really don't go all in on data center design and data center architecture or site selection or real estate investment or anything like that. And then management, that's up and running. You're commissioned, your data center is in use, and they're helping to provide kind of the real estate management, the property management. And what's interesting is over time, as I've noticed some of the big data center real estate companies, DCRE companies, increasingly getting involved in providing outsourced services that provide kind of that outsourced property management at like the property level. And that's different than like what happens inside at the facilities level. And that's different than what happens inside at the technology kind of level. So your firm, for guessing you have the resources to do this well, because it's complex to be able to do all 3 of these, is doing a good job of building a business around data center design, construction, and management, and you want to market and sell more effectively. With the resources that you have to be able to be in all 3 of these core businesses, you more than likely are a national or global player already, meaning you have hundreds of employees or thousands of employees or perhaps tens of thousands of employees. And because of that, building up a very strong brand with multiple stakeholders throughout the ecosystem is incredibly important. When I mentioned a few moments ago that data center design / architecture can be a standalone business, that means by definition that data center design firms, data center architecture firms have their own set of ideal client profiles and their own set of primary, secondary, tertiary buyer personas. Data center construction, data center general contractor kind of firms also have their own way of defining their ideal client profile and their addressable market, their target account list, and their prioritized buyer personas. In construction and design, some of these, especially where it gets involved in land use and permitting and zoning, it gets really, really complicated with the amount of stakeholders, that community stakeholders that are even involved at this stage. And data center management also, as mentioned, as you think about management as like the outermost part of the property, and then there's interaction with facilities managers internally and technologists internally. So there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to all of this. So the reality is, marketing and selling these data center solutions, you have to figure out for your core business model, are there one of these services that you want to lead with, or are you trying to find the unicorn client that wants all three of these from the same company? If you're trying to find the unicorn client that comes from the same companies, what I encourage you to do is to look at where you've had unicorn success already. Figure out in your testimonials, in your case studies, in your logos on your website, where you've had the greatest success. What do these magic clients have in common? They're probably pretty big. I can't imagine a scenario where clients can afford a single point of contact solution for design, construction, and management that aren't like Fortune 5,000 level kinds of companies. So I don't know that you're going to put that much effort into the employee headcount size of your ideal client profile, because I can't imagine a scenario where you can sell all three of these services to companies that don't have at least 500, at least 1,000 employees, that aren't at least $50, $100 million, $250 million or your local currency equivalent kinds of companies already. So yeah, there's going to be a very, very high floor on that, quite different than like selling co-location space to small SMB, startup-y kind of scale-up-y kind of businesses. So these are large, for the most part, either large mid-market or enterprise clients already. They could be national, they could be multinational kinds of clients. I'd also dig into what industries they tend to be located within. Are you going to have a deep specialization in working with data center operators, like co-location operators, hyperscale operators, edge operators? Are you going to work with more end user enterprises that have their own data centers within end users that have their own data centers? Are you specializing in a certain vertical like manufacturing, healthcare, financial services, or something like that? Again, only you can answer where you've had the most success and where you want more like that. But I'd encourage you to get really that specific on geographically how big they need to be. It's obviously going to be a pretty high ceiling on how big they need to be to afford your minimums, and what industries or business models they tend to be located within. From there, you should be able to build out a target account list of a defined list of companies, and depending on how expansive your geographic coverage is relative to the market size, it could be as few as a few dozen companies. In most cases, it's probably a couple hundred companies or a couple thousand companies. It's going to be up to you to decide from like a sales territory perspective, how do you divvy this up among different people on your team? Are you dividing up by company size? Are you dividing up by industry? Are you dividing up by geographic, or all of the above? If you have a huge sales organization, maybe it's geographic plus size plus industry, or geographic plus industry specialization. I can tell you increasingly what I see across the board with both our consulting clients and people that I host on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is industry specialization is becoming table stakes, meaning that in a global hyper-competitive marketplace, most account executives, most account managers over time, in order to have enough leverage in a self-driven buyer's journey to get in early and often, need to have deep expertise in a particular vertical, in a particular industry, so that they're seen more as peers by their prospects and clients. So this is where you start to see business developers, sales developers, account managers, account executives specializing like in financial services, or specializing in telecommunications, or specializing in healthcare. And what this usually means is the person or persons that you're hiring into these roles come from that background already. In a perfect world, they sold data center design and construction and management in that industry already, but usually the next best is something that's related to that, meaning that you're wanting them to grow in healthcare or grow in data center operators, and they've already done this for a big data center operator. Like maybe they've already been doing this for years with Digital Realty or Equinix or something like that. And you think it would be fantastic to get someone with that kind of background to join or lead a team like yours that's growing your client base with marketing and selling these kinds of data center solutions. So yeah, there's that specialization. And then once you've tightened up that ideal client profile and like for the healthcare team, who's the most important and second most important kind of stakeholders that they need to build relationships with, that they need to educate and build trust with, that they need to build pipeline with. The most important economic decision maker, economic stakeholder, that'll be the primary buyer persona. The second most important, that'll be the secondary buyer persona. And then your marketing and sales leaders working together need to do the homework, do the research, and figure out the 5 or 6 biggest goals, 5 or 6 biggest challenges for each of those 2 segments. Use that information to make sure that your website content, your digital content, your decks, your copywriting, your emails, your social posts, your digital ad strategy, your event strategy really is heavily client-centric based on what you learned from that customer insight research. That's the most important to help you resonate, empathetic, showing extreme empathy for the goals that they're trying to figure out individually as a team and as a company, and what they're struggling with the most, what they're stressed out about, what they're challenged the most at the intersection of like their job, what their team is working on, what their company's working on, that aligns with like the need at some point in the near future for data center design, data center construction, and outsourced data center management. And once you do that, that is not only used for your website and email and social and digital ads and events, but those subtopics that you discovered, 5 or 6 big goals, 5 or 6 big challenges, each of those 10 or 12 topics merits having a monthly focus for your monthly in-person event, for your monthly virtual event, for both your monthly in-person event and your monthly virtual event. And because this is so ridiculously hyper-specific, you don't need large numbers of people attending these from the right accounts to really start to move the needle. But what you do need is a deep understanding of what they're going through, what's in their objectives and key results, what's in their job description that determines whether they get promoted or whether they get fired, what's stressing them out to no end, and how can you add tremendous amounts of value to their business decisions, to their professional development, to their learning and development. Ideally, that's so valuable that they want to bring their coworkers, other team members, potentially their boss, other members of the decision committee along with them to learn together and grow together. And when you do this well, they'll want to come back and they will bring more of their coworkers with them, and you'll gain more foothold into these accounts for marketing and selling your data center solutions that are directly or indirectly related to a upcoming need for data center design, construction, and outsourced data center management. So again, understand your business model. Is it a magic client that wants all 3? Are you potentially running 3 different go-to-market playbooks? How are you segmenting up your teams by geography, by company size, by industry? It's a complex question, but at a high level, get really empathetic to understanding what's going on in their world. Get very specific about who the there is. I think a lot of people struggle with that, is understanding who the most important segments are, the most important personas are in these accounts and what's going on in their world. And I think there's a lot of people too, especially in the construction, real estate, and investment side, that tend to go way too broad in their marketing and sales, like that they're punting this 80-90% of their investment to massive national and global conferences, where if they really look at their ideal client profile and they look at that conference's demographics last year and what's projected to be this year, they may discover that some of the conferences that they're investing in are a fantastic fit, where there's a really good match rate between your ideal clients and their attendees. And some of the conferences have an abysmal fit, a terrible fit between who they tend to attract and who you want to get in front of. So that's like the first level. The second level is, okay, now it's the right people. How do we educate and build trust with those people at that conference? So I can tell you without a doubt that if they're just dropping by your booth to collect some swag and to get a ticket to get a free drink at the happy hour, and you're chatting with them for 45 seconds, you're not educating and building trust. You're throwing a big cocktail party where people are mingling and having a lot of fun. I don't know if you're even building trust, but you're certainly not educating. It's incredibly important that you put yourself in a situation, you put yourself and your sales team, your go-to-market teams in situations where they can educate and build trust with these ideal clients, with these most important members of the decision committee, with these most important stakeholders that are going to be in market in the near future for data center design, data center construction, and data center management. And that's the tricky part with all of this, is when they're going to be in market is a timing issue. Journeys are long. People are really, really risk averse. It's very common to find 25 to 30 touch points now between complete stranger and purchase decision. And so many companies are only in there for one or two. It's like dipping your pinky toe into the pool, and your competitors are dived into the pool. They have their whole team in the pool, and they're surround sounding your prospects and clients, and they're driving the whole process. It's incredibly important that if you're serious about these ideal clients in your target account list, that you have as many touch points, as much surface area as you possibly can in these accounts. And the way to get in early and often, in nearly all cases today, with people that are more sales allergic than ever, is education and trust building. In order to do education and trust building, they need to see your client-facing team members more as consultants, experts, trusted advisors, teachers, and a lot less like vendors who are just trying to get some points on the deals board. So that's at a high level how a company in the data center construction, real estate, and investment part of the data center ecosystem, specifically focusing on data center design, construction, and management, and market and sell data center solutions. If you've been enjoying this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show so far, make sure that you hit the like button. It helps spread the word. And that brings us to our final question for this week's show. What do we got? Okay, last question for this week is on this is a hybrid between data center operators and data center real estate. So how do we establish wholesale data center brand recognition in the marketplace? How do we establish wholesale data center brand recognition in the marketplace? So again, a wholesale data center provider is actually quite different than a data center operator that is focused on colocation. Typically, a wholesale data center provider has land and power and a slab, and maybe they're selling the shell, and they want someone else to basically take it over from there. They're doing very little in the commissioning department. They're leaving that up to their anchor tenant, their master tenant, or maybe they may rent off large pieces of that to a few huge tenants, but they're definitely not getting involved in selling 4, 5, 6-figure colocation deals where there's potentially a couple dozen clients occupying that particular facility. So because of that, being a wholesale data center has a lot in common with selling to hyperscale data center clients, or being a hyperscale data center operator that only sells huge amounts of space to 1 or 2 or 3 huge clients in a particular facility or on a particular campus. So with that in mind, when it comes to establishing brand recognition in the marketplace, it's really important to understand that your brand today is so different than what it took to build a brand 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, as a wholesale data center provider, like most of the data center ecosystem, it was very common to find that your best prospects and clients, future clients, would get about halfway through research and decision making. They do a considerable amount of learning on their own, and they'd get to the 57% point in their buyer's journey, their research and decision-making process. And they'd say, like, I've taken this as far as I can for the final 43% of my journey. Yep, now it's time to meet with some sales folks and learn from them and gather some information. And they may not have realized that they were a 57%er, or that they were ready for those conversations in the 43%, but like CEB, the corporate executive board, working with Serious Decisions and Salesforce, validated this very widely utilized data point among sales leaders, sales operations, marketing operations leaders 10 years ago. However, now with 10 years of digital transformation, millions of baby boomers retiring, more Gen Z and more millennials in the decision-making role, tens of millions of people working from home at the start of the 2020s, and that 57% number has jumped all the way to 83%. Gartner found 83% of researching, comparing options, evaluating pricing now happens without you in the room. Even in huge real estate deals, even in huge wholesale data center deals. It doesn't matter who your target audience is, who your ideal clients are, who your target buyer personas are. No one wants to spend a ton of time hanging out with salespeople anymore, which is why I don't understand why people are still putting millions of dollars a year into cabana parties and golf tournaments. Take the same people and reposition them as instructors, educators, teachers, consultants, subject matter experts with the same audience, except instead of whining and dining, teach them how they can close the gaps on their biggest business goals that can get them a promotion. Teach them on how they can address their biggest stressors and challenges that are driving them nuts, screwing with their work-life balance, maybe even messing with their mental health, certainly compromising their ability to unplug and have good vacations. The better job you can do at that of educating and building trust, the more natural everything else is. But there is a lot of resources fighting this. It's so strange because we're in the technology business, and yet we're thinking that the people that are going to be digital transformation champions on the real estate side in this particular case, or on the data center development side, or on the finance side, or the investment side, we think they're still looking around for their BlackBerry. Gee, where's the fax machine? Anyone seen the Yellow Pages lately? Do you really, really believe that your buyers are so different that they haven't been influenced by search and social media and mobile devices? You really think your prospects and clients haven't heard of ChatGPT and Gemini and Claude and Perplexity and YouTube and LinkedIn at this stage of the game? The crazy part is I'm on the younger side of Gen X. All the baby boomers that I know that still actively work in this industry, not that many on a full-time basis anymore, but a lot that are still working on a part-time or advisory basis anymore. Just about all of them are so digitally comfortable. They're on LinkedIn all day long. They're speaking at webinars. They're in demand to speak at webinars because of the stage they're at in their career. They're on podcasts like ours all the time. I can tell you without a doubt that when you send them a message on LinkedIn, when you mention them on LinkedIn, they are digitally savvy. They're learning on LinkedIn. They're learning on YouTube. They do searches on ChatGPT just like everyone else. So if you're thinking that you have digitally resistant buyers and your prospects and clients still learn the old way, that they're waiting for a piece of direct mail to land in their mailbox, that they're waiting for the newspaper at the foot of their driveway in the morning so they can check out what happened to NVIDIA or Intel or Microsoft yesterday in the printed pages of the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times or your local equivalent. Like, this old school thinking is messing you up in more ways than you likely realize, or at least is keeping you invisible, and it's diverting a lot of resources. The closer you can get to understanding the preferences of your ideal clients, of your prioritized buyer personas for wholesale data center deals, the easier it is going to be. Even in the DCRE, the data center real estate space, we are increasingly seeing companies and individuals recognizing how incredibly important it is to double down on webinars and thought leadership reports and public speaking and podcasting, because this is one of the last ways that they have to truly differentiate and get in early and often. Depending on the size of your facilities, depending on the marketplace where you're located in, if you're trying to build your own go-to-market as opposed to punting this completely to a third party like DCRE kind of company to run this for you, it is incredibly important that you be very deliberate about understanding exactly who you're trying to reach, who these ideal clients are, who these ideal tenants are, who the master tenant is, building a defined list of, in many cases, in a small region, it could be as few as a couple dozen companies, and figuring out who, for your size of company and your value proposition, who are the most important stakeholders that you need to build relationships with. And a lot of who you lead with will depend on your biggest value proposition and how you're positioning your brand going forward. But again, I talked about this a few moments ago. Building a brand is so different today because of the self-driven journey. Like 10 years ago, it wasn't just that you had a lot more surface area in these opportunities. It was that brand was aesthetics. Brand was your hexadecimal colors, was your fonts, was your logo, and your brand was locked up in Creative Suite by a designer who had to have a PhD in Adobe Creative Suite to be able to do this. Increasingly, we're seeing across the entire IT ecosystem, especially in infrastructure. We're seeing in mid-market and enterprises, Canva is the great democratizer. And because of that, it's democratizing and enabling sales executives that are non-designers and same thing with marketers to get stuff out faster. That agility, that speed is incredibly important because the brand today is no longer just about aesthetics. Your brand is what your marketplace says about you when you are not in the room. And in a self-driven buyer's journey, best case scenario, you're locked out of the room for the first 83%. You're only, even if you do everything perfectly, you're only in there the final 17%. The way to earn your way back in is to get the heck out of the vendor box, escape from the vendor box, and stay out of the vendor box. And the way you do that is you and your client-facing team members need to show up looking a lot more like experts, consultants, teachers, and trusted advisors, and a lot less like traditional data center developers, a lot less like traditional real estate developers, industrial real estate developers. That's not who they want to learn from. They want to learn from experts that look a lot like their peers, where they can learn best practices on how to do their job better. That can help them do their job so well that they can get a promotion and a bonus. And that can get rid of so much of their stress, their anxiety, their challenges that are driving them nuts, that it dramatically gets rid of internal friction, makes them look like a hero, makes them a lot more emotionally available for their coworkers and their friends and family members, allows them to unplug and actually go on vacation once in a while. The better job you can do with that extreme empathy, with instead of showing up with a take it or leave it kind of static pitch and another golf tournament sponsorship and another cocktail party sponsorship and another community fair, and instead focus on taking the people that are most important and teaching them how they can do their job better with understanding best practices for how a data center construction manager, a data center site planner, a data center commissioning expert, whoever your data center investor, whoever your most important stakeholders are for this kind of project, they want to learn from their peers. If you have peers of those personas on your core team, fantastic. This is a company culture initiative that needs to start at the top, because you need to sit down with these experts and say like, hey, we've done the homework on your peers who do a similar job that you used to do. This is what they care about. Can you put together a half hour, 45-minute talk that you can do once a quarter, once a year, whatever, that shares 10 best practices on how they can do their job better, ideally with some data-backed research? Be like, yeah, that'll move the needle. Okay, so let's say out of these 10 or 12 topics that come up that are most important to each of these segments, you can cover 80% of them with internal subject matter experts. How do you bridge the gap on the rest? Your friends, your colleagues, your contractors, others that you have your relationships with, you bring them in as guest speakers. If they want to speak for exposure, great. If they need a small honorarium or quid pro quo or co-marketing, you figure that out. That's up to you. But at the end of the day, we want to deliver value to your prospects and clients. And the way you deliver value in a learning and development, professional development context is most of the time they want to learn from their peers. If you can do this through a best practices how-to session, if you're bringing in 3 or 4 people and moderating a panel, if you're doing all of this, if you're doing a half-a-day symposia, you're doing a full-day event, you're doing this virtual, you're recording it, there's a lot of different ways to go after this. But if you're trying to build your own demand generation, your own go-to-market playbook as a supplement or potential replacement from punting the whole thing to a data center real estate firm, this is how you get in early. This is how you get in often, is get really, really close to these most important stakeholders and figure out how you can add value to their world, not because you have a property to sell them that has cheap power or is available power at all in a particular region. That matters as well. But for all but the hungriest audiences, you're more than likely, unless you have a very, very well-known brand in that local marketplace, going to need to start from a position of educating and building trust. If you already have a national brand or a global brand that's got billions of dollars in brand equity, yeah, you can potentially go in for the kill. You can propose marriage on the first date. But for most people that are asking this kind of question of how a wholesale data center brand can drive stronger brand recognition in the marketplace, if they don't have a global brand, education and trust building is incredibly important. And that starts with extreme empathy and extreme understanding for who the most important stakeholders are, what's going on in their world, and how you can deliver value to all of the goals and challenges that are a leading indicator for them being in market, for being the master tenant, the lead tenant, the anchor tenant for your wholesale data center property. So that's bridging the world of data center provider and data center real estate, maybe even a little bit of data center investment, how to establish a wholesale data center brand recognition strategy in the marketplace. And that's the final question that we'll be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've enjoyed this week's show, make sure to hit the like button. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments and we will add that to the consideration queue. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, be sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes weekly to your email inbox on Sundays. You can subscribe. You can sign up for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI and host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. If you and I are not currently connected on LinkedIn and you'd like to be, make sure when you send me a connection request that you mention that you like to watch the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. Just like you, I get flooded with dozens of requests a week. And one of the quickest ways for me to shortlist you is by mentioning specifically that you're a fan of Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A. Until next week, we wish you great success in growing your team's influence, your team's role, your individual influence, and your company's role in the amazing period of opportunity that we're experiencing right now in data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. We wish you great success and look forward to seeing you back again next week. Take care now.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com.